Okay, I don't want to be negative or to sort of dampen the collective enthusiasm that people have these days about the alleged emerging multipolarity in the world, but I think we sort of need a bit of a reality check. What we're seeing with the BRICS project, with multiple countries applying for or are interested in joining BRICS, and the talk about creating an alternative currency for trade between BRICS members and so on. I think we need to realize that this is not a phenomenon that is ambushing the U.S. or the West. Many people, regular people, may not be aware of this, though it's not secret information by any means. Both the concept of BRICS and the term BRICS was launched by Goldman Sachs some 20 years ago. Goldman Sachs. There was a man named Jim O'Neill, who was the chief of Goldman Sachs back in 2001. And he coined the term BRICS and somewhat arbitrarily grouped Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and later South Africa together. Because he predicted that, largely because of demographics, that these economies would grow and overtake the G7 in importance within the next 40 years. He believed that globalization could not sustainably continue to be American-dominated, because basically that was just too politically messy and too blatantly imperialistic. So Goldman Sachs created the idea of BRICS and marketed it as a brand, so much so that they even tried to trademark the word BRICS. So investment firms across the US and Europe, they bought the marketing, they bought the hype. And, BRICS investment funds were popping up all over the place. And eventually, even the governments of the BRICS nations actually formed a proper bloc. But this is a grouping that was willed into being by investors, by Goldman Sachs, by the private sector, and driven by a belief, which, if understood properly, was that global business had to free itself from Western and American centricity. The owners and controllers of global financialized capital outgrew the confines of patriotism. Company logos replaced national flags. So this project has been decades in the making. This shift has been planned for nearly half my lifetime. And it has been planned by the global financial elite. And now that same Jim O'Neill is calling for BRICS to create their own currency. Now, he's retired now, but he's still the voice of Goldman Sachs. So no one who matters is bothered about de-dollarization. This is what I've been saying for months now. Moving away from the dollar is part of the shift of the global economy being undertaken by the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. The destabilization of Europe is a part of that shift as well. Over 130 billion euros of direct investment have exited Germany over just the past year, with only 10 billion coming in. Corporate bankruptcies in Germany are at record highs. The manufacturing heart of Europe is deindustrializing. And that's because the OCGFC have determined that Europe no longer holds significant promise in the future of the global economy. Meaning that they don't see sustainable profitability for themselves in Europe. And the cold hard reality is they're not wrong. But the colder and harder reality is that they, not the governments of Europe, get to decide that that means that Europe and the people of the West are superfluous. Because your value is determined entirely by your utility to the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. Consider this. Europe's demographic collapse means that your only real remedy, potentially, is to ramp up immigration. Well, depending upon from which country you're talking about, between 40% to 60% of non-European immigrants to the EU are unskilled. So that doesn't actually help you very much. But in a way, it represents, instead of a knowledge transfer, an ignorance transfer from the global south to Europe, removing unskilled, unqualified people from the economies that the OCGFC are focusing on developing, unburdening those economies of their own superfluous citizens. Meanwhile, of course, the presence of immigrants also allows native Europeans to direct their hostility over their own redundance against foreigners, and conflict ensues. The OCGFC see all of you as insignificant. And if all of Europe just turns into a giant cage fight between the white, black, and brown superfluous people, they're fine with that. That can turn a profit. Now, I should mention also that 10 years ago or so, BlackRock was promoting investment in other emerging economies outside of BRICS, namely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. Now look at those countries now. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman didn't say that the Middle East was going to be the new Europe for nothing. He consults with Goldman Sachs, he consults with BlackRock, he consults with the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. He knows what the plans are, and then he makes his own plans accordingly. I mean, BlackRock controls a subsidiary of Aramco, so they're very close. So the point is, none of this is unsettling. None of this is surprising. None of this is catching the West or America off guard. And none of this represents the emergence of any real multipolarity in the world. It's a logical, capitalistically natural transition, largely influenced by demographic trends and by the fact that the West allowed the development of a parallel power structure in the private sector that inevitably surpassed state power and outgrew nationalism. This is why I don't really believe that de-dollarization is going to be meaningfully fought by the U.S., nor are we likely to see imperialistic wars and occupations of the BRICS nations by the United States. Private sector power has already conquered the U.S. Their own armed forces are more likely to be used to occupy their own country more than any other country, just to suppress their own populations who are increasingly dispossessed. I mean, think about the fact that the anti-Russian sanctions have actually benefited Russia financially. And not only Russia, India, China, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others. I mean, FDI into Brazil, for example, is at its highest level since 2015. FDI into South Africa roughly doubled since the start of the Ukraine war. Ukraine has basically been a hinge, pivoting the global economy to the east and to the south. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this shift would not have happened without Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs and the owners and controllers of global financialized capital simply saw the writing on the wall and took action. They didn't cause the demographic collapse of Europe, but they saw it happening, and they were astute enough to anticipate the ramifications of that, and they came up with a plan B. And the B stands for BRICS.